Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. And my name is Francesca Bastianini. I will have all of our panelists start by turning on their videos. So welcome to How Very Queer, LGBTQ plus identities in the lighting industry. We're really glad that you're all here. Thank you for joining us today. This is a joint program with Women in Lighting, with NACLIQ, the North American Coalition of Lighting Industry Queers, and Women in Lighting and Design WILD. So we have a lot of people who have come together to share information with you, to share information with our community globally. So really glad that we have all of you. And we have a lovely, lovely panel. So I will get started. My name is Francesca Bastianini. As I said, my pronouns are she, her. I am the ambassador for the US for the Women in Lighting Project and a principal of Sighte Studio, which is a lighting firm in Brooklyn, New York, and Delray, Florida, as well as part-time faculty at Parsons teaching in the lighting program. And now I'd like to introduce Sophie O'rourke.
Hi, my name is Sophie O'rourke. I'm a lighting designer at Nolte in London. I'm originally from Brisbane, Australia, and I moved to London about 4 years ago. And now I'd like to introduce Alana.
I'm Alana Shepard, pronoun she, her. I am a lighting industry veteran. I have lived in New York for 15 years, but I recently moved to Washington State, where I am the principal of Intangible Light. I'm also the founder of the North American Coalition of Lighting Industry Queers, or NACLIQ. Now I'd like to introduce Marian.
Hola, I am Marian Velez. My pronouns she, her. I am the ambassador for the WILD project in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and we recently started. Wish me luck. I have a design studio. It's called 22 Studio. It's a women-led practice, and we work between Philadelphia and Puerto Rico.
So now, and we also wanted to thank Kelly Roberts, who you do not see on your screen right now, but WILD, who is hosting this webinar today. So she is behind the scenes if you want to say hi in the chat as well. As a reminder, we will be going through the presentation, a little overview and context, why we're doing this, giving you some history, some feedback, some context for Pride and for the LGBTQ queer community, as well as giving you some definitions, questions that you have that you may not have another space to or exposure to ask them, as well as sharing some of our personal experience. If you have any questions, we'll be answering those at the end of our session today. So you can use the Q&A function. We know that the chat is already full of conversation, but just it will be easier for us to manage to make sure that we answer all your questions if we see it in the Q&A. As if any of you have submitted prior to the program, through the Google form, we have those as well, and we'll get to them. So let's get started. Why this panel? Why are you here? Well, hopefully because you like us and you're excited to see and hear from us. In addition, we are all part of the Women in Lighting community. As Women in Lighting the project evolves, we want to make sure that we're inclusive of all women and gender nonconforming individuals that form part of our community. The hope is that by sharing some of our experience, that we're going to be able to open pathways of communication across members across the globe. In the presentation today, you'll see some queer tidbits, little random facts that we wanted to add. So we won't necessarily address those, but you'll be able to see them on your screen. Why now? So the panel is occurring now in June because it is typically Pride Month. It is officially Pride Month within the United States, as well as in many other countries. And it's a time to remember sort of a moment in history. Queer people, LGBTQ plus IA people have been around forever, but the moment in history in 1969 is when the Stonewall Riots occurred. And it was a riot that was led by trans women of color. And it propelled the gay liberation movement within the US. And it's something that we continue to celebrate and commemorate, because while we've made great strides within many countries for queer rights, that's not the case for every member of the community, and it's not the case in every country. The first Pride was a riot. You'll hear this quote shared often. This is the Stonewall Inn. It is a preserved landmark within the West Village of Manhattan in New York. The police raided this inn in June 28th of 1969, and that raid turned into 6 days of riots and protests. A year later was the first Pride parade. I wouldn't say parade, first Pride March. It went by a different name, the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, and it occurred on the last Sunday in June, which is why typically we celebrate within New York. It's the Pride Parade is the last Sunday in June. Pride celebrations around the world happen in different times of year, many of them centering around June. So that's the timing of this. And what is Pride now? A lot of times what you see represented is a huge celebration, a party, exuberance, so much color. But it is also still a symbol of rebellion, because we understand that not everybody has the same rights, and we still have a ways to go. But we also want to have fun. So here's a little bit of what Pride looks like. Huge strides in the 2019 New York City Pride, which celebrated 50 years after the Stonewall riot. But we also had examples like in Mumbai, where in 2019, this was a march to celebrate the decriminalization of homosexuality. So very different levels across the world. An image of celebration for Pride in Beirut, as well as the present sort of the tension between people trying to express themselves and celebrate, and how, in this case, troops are encircling Pride in Russia in 2019. So very different experiences across the world. And Pride doesn't just mean the one parade. It normally occurs over a long period, like a month, and different events. And in this case, it also, while it was started by trans women of color, they haven't always been central in the celebration of Pride. So last year, in June of 2020, there was an action which brought together about 15,000 people in New York for Black trans lives. And you might be familiar with the Pride flag, 6 colors, created by Gilbert Baker. But the queer community sort of is represented in a multitude of different flags, which we'll talk about later. And I'll now pass this over to Alana.
So Francesca mentioned that Pride is a celebration, but it's also a time of reflection on the battles that have been fought. But it's also a recognition that there are so many more battles to fight. This is the state of the nation today. So you see there are, so the green represents states that have a high overall policy tally, which means, so it's kind of ambiguous. This is from the LGBT map, lgbtmap.org, and they have a sort of a metric of how accepting legally states are. So the green is good, red is bad. That kind of makes sense, right? Red actually means there are actively laws that have a negative impact on LGBTQ folks. So places like South Carolina and Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi, places in the deep South, mostly, that are actually in one way or another taking away the rights or suppressing the rights of LGBTQ folks. So there are still big battles to be fought. I mean, if you've been paying attention, this year has been huge in that arena, specifically with regard to trans individuals. There's another map which I'm not going to show, that's a lot redder, and that's specific to anti-trans laws, laws that have been passed. And thankfully, just yesterday in late breaking news, the Biden administration announced that they are extending Title IX benefits or Title IX protections to LGBTQ individuals. So those laws that have been proposed in state legislatures and have been passed in some states will hopefully be rendered null and void. So that was a huge win that happened just yesterday, and I'm so happy and so excited. If you've been following my Instagram feed, I've been harping on this for months now. It's something everybody should know about, and everybody should be fighting, because it's basic rights. It's basic rights. Anyway, we can move on. So, it's not just in the United States. So there's a lot to fight here, but in the global scale, the United States isn't that bad. You start looking at the Middle East and Africa and the Russian Federation and other places in Asia. Again, that red is bad news. That's people being oppressed in one way or another, including in places like Iran and Azerbaijan and Afghanistan, places like that. The punishment is death. People are being killed for just being themselves. So it's not good, and there's still a lot of work to do. So let's talk a little bit about rainbow washing. You see in social media, everybody's icons has suddenly turned rainbow. There's so much color, up to and including the White House, every company you can imagine, Facebook, Nike, McDonald's, Coca-Cola. It's just all over the place. And you would think that it's just a perfect, happy, rainbow-colored world, but that's not really the case. This is all about profit. This is about leveraging the public sentiment, which is positive for the most part for LGBTQ folks, to increase sales, while pacifying a vocal minority of, us, into thinking that everything's hunky-dory. Not the case. Let's move on. So, for example, AT&T, while pushing Pride in their social media and having a vocal and active Pride campaign, donated $2.7 million to 193 anti-gay politicians. This is endemic throughout the corporate world. Xfinity, Comcast, the Home Depot, General Electric, Verizon, Pfizer, Coca-Cola's on that list. It goes on. I only picked 6, but there's a whole lot more. I mean, anybody who has, who wants to protect their corporate interests, they're going to put that first. They're going to put profit before our lives. And that's something that needs to be recognized, and it needs to be called out. So I did a little bit of research, and I think I'm going to make this something that I want to investigate much deeper as a NACLIQ initiative. I dug a little bit into the lighting world. So I looked at the 4 big conglomerates: Acuity, Hubble, Signify, and Legrand, and just took a snapshot of what they're doing. So let's take a look at Acuity, for example. They have a big Pride push going on. They've been putting up employee testimonials on social media. They haven't rainbow branded their icons and such, but they are really touting the fact that they have an employee resource group and that they have a really welcoming and open culture. Pardon me for a minute, I have to pull up some notes. However, it's not quite so great there. Just anecdotally, I've spoken to one former employee there who said that culture is very much different. It's very openly homophobic and misogynistic. One example, with regard to the Pulse nightclub shooting, like the day after the Pulse nightclub shooting, in an open office environment and without any repercussion or consequence, one salesperson said, "That was God punishing the gays for their sins." and there were no consequences. Someone else said, yeah, queerness is a slippery slope to bestiality and pedophilia. So you can see, unless that kind of thing is being smacked down, that rainbow image is not quite so true. So they have an employee resource group. Hopefully that's helping change the culture, but I have to wonder how genuine that is, and whether it's just a way of like kettling those people from having any real impact. And I'd love to hear about that if anybody has some thoughts about that offline. Hubble Lighting, moving on. They have made a pride statement. They've said they're making a year-round commitment to inclusion. I'd love to see it. I want to see outside of June that actually happening, because part of rainbow washing is in June turning everything rainbow and showing these employee testimonials and saying, oh, happy Pride and whatnot. And then as soon as June 30th rolls around, it all disappears. And then it's just quiet for another year. Since they've made a commitment to year-round inclusion, we'll be watching. Acuity, Hubble, and Legrand are based in hostile states that I showed you earlier. So Acuity is based in Georgia, Hubble is based in South Carolina, Signify is in Massachusetts and Georgia, and Legrand is also in South Carolina. So aside from Massachusetts, those are all hostile states. Those are all states that have had anti-LGBTQ or specifically anti-trans legislation in their state legislatures this year. So if they're actually supporting us, if they're actually true allies and advocates, I feel they need to make a statement to that end. It's the same thing as the voting laws in Georgia. If people are being oppressed by their states, then I think these companies with their leverage have a responsibility to their employees and their customers to say that and to act in their favor. So Hubble has made a year-round commitment. Signify hasn't really said much, but they're a big company and they have big operations in Georgia. Now, anecdotally and personally anecdotally, I know that company is very inclusive and welcoming. I've spoken to the senior leadership at Cooper specifically, and they're really good and really genuine from everything I can say personally, and I'm glad to see it. So Legrand, which is based in South Carolina, they have a non-discrimination policy and an employee resource group, as does Signify, and they're highlighting their employee resource group, and they have a link to their diversity policy. However, digging into that policy, I've noticed that it's very binary. So they speak about increasing diversity, gender diversity in hiring and in promotion, but it's binary. It's women only, and nowhere in their diversity policy is there mention of gender identity. So I think that's something that perhaps they should take a look at and change.
Thank you, Alana. So I think one of the things to summarize there is just understanding that we are not living just as individuals within our different firms or companies, but also the impact that our employers and our community members have on sort of our existence. And with that, we want to move into sort of a quick section of definitions. We by no means can give you all the answers, definitely not in this period of time, but it's a starting point. So obviously, if there's any questions that you have that we can answer today, we will do so. If there's any questions that you have afterwards, please also reach out. We want to be able to provide resources. We will follow up with an email of resources and links as well. Definitions starting with queer. And I'd like to invite Sophie to join us.
Hi there. So for the word queer, I'd like to start with a bit of a quick history of the word queer. The word itself turned up in the English language around 1513, and in the past it's meant not normal, peculiar, or odd. And in the early 1900s, it was first adopted as a derogatory slang term meaning homosexual. I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who do know it to be derogatory. By the late 80s and early 90s, there were small individuals and groups of people beginning to take it on as sort of a reclamation. They were starting to use it as a positive self-label. And then since, at least personally, I've seen since the sort of boom of the social media age and the past sort of 5 to 10 years on the internet, the words really spread as very much a positive self-label. And a lot of especially young people now are using it as this sort of all-inclusive term. So rather than saying LGBTQIA+, it's a lot easier just to say queer, and everyone knows what you mean by that. And I think it's a really good term for both communication and for self-identification. So in terms of communication, if you're, for example, telling a story and your queerness is pertinent to the story, rather than sort of going, so look, I'm bisexual, but I'm actually, maybe I'm pan and I'm kind of questioning, rather than going down that rabbit hole, you can just sort of say queer and be done with it. And then in terms of self-identification, I think personally, it's a really useful term for people who are bisexual, who are pansexual, who are gender non-binary or gender fluid. For a lot of people who aren't sort of straight up, gay or lesbian or, trans, it's a very useful sort of term that you can use as a placeholder, or even if you don't really want to take on a specific label, you can just use queer. So yeah, I think personally I found it a really useful tool. I know a lot of other people do as well, and potentially older people might not sort of glue as kindly to this word because of its past connotations, but I know a lot of young people today don't even know it was a slur once upon a time. So yeah, that's the word queer.
Thank you, Sophie. So big topics, fairly complex topics that I'm going to try and simplify very quickly. Sex, gender, sexual orientation. You think they're all smashed together the same thing. They are absolutely not. They are very different parts. And boxes and constructs, we live within a lot of different social constructs, primarily ones that we also learn from in our immediate families, from our societal groups, from our different social norms. But let's get started with one way to separate these things. This is a diagram that was updated in 2011 based on a diagram that was created in 2000. 2011 is now already a very long time ago. So this is not the best way to describe it, but it's hard to sort of say, how do we separate and parse out all of these different things? Sex being anatomical about our chromosomes, our hormones, gender identity, gender expression, and our sexual orientation, all being separate from that. And that we can fall within all of these different scales, that it is not always binary. In fact, it is rarely binary in any of these instances. So if we're looking at sex, it's a label. We often hear the term biological sex, but there are particularly many people who are gender non-conforming, non-binary, or trans who are starting to push that we talk about it as sex assigned at birth. It is essentially the doctor who is saying, this is what I see, this is what you are. When the case is actually not just biological sex, but it's a lot more complicated. It isn't that we have one or the other. We have a whole spectrum of different chromosomes, and depending on that combination, our hormones and our chromosomes are presenting different ways anatomically. So the idea of binary sex really doesn't exist when you can see this full spectrum in the middle. Again, very complex, trying to simplify it in a very short amount of time. Then we move to gender. Gender is a much bigger, more complicated thing. And we're talking about gender roles, the expectations that society has of us, that we have of ourselves based on what we've internalized. And a lot of that is also considered on a sort of binary of men and women. And to say that we often confuse sex and gender is an understatement. We think that it's the same thing when often we have people who are cisgender in that their gender aligns with the sex assigned at birth. And we have people who are transgender, where those things don't align, or gender non-conforming, somewhere where there's a split along that spectrum. Gender identity is also in terms of how you feel inside, but also your gender presentation, how you dress. Again, along a scale. If we are looking at the gender terms of more masculine or more feminine, we also have a variety of different ways of presenting along that are always based on sort of societal norms that we're aware that we work with, but there is, I think, increasing freedom to be able to present your gender differently and have freedom that it doesn't have to always stay the same either. And sexual orientation. Who are you attracted to? What makes you interested in the people to have, you know, intimacy, both physical and sort of emotional intimacy with others? So that's how we're trying to separate all of these different things and give you a sense that when we talk about queer and we talk about LGBTQIA+, we're talking about a lot of these things sort of smashed together. And the fact that one person is, you know, we'll talk more personally afterwards, but I can say I'm a cisgender woman means that my gender identity aligns with the sex that I was assigned at birth. The fact that I also happen to be a lesbian or queer doesn't necessarily have to do with my sex or gender. It is in addition to that. So more questions, I'm sure, but let's leave that as our quick definitions. And with that, what does LGBTQIA+ mean? It means that we're a big umbrella. It means that there's a lot of different things to parse out here. Alana, can I have you join us again?
Sure. In the last few years, because only maybe 10 years ago, there was just the rainbow flag. And since then, the different subsets of queerness, of LGBTQ, have created their own space and made themselves more present and more known, and we're all proud of who we are. So we've all created these different flags, and I wanted to make this a quiz. I thought that would be fun, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge to learn all the flags. So in just, I think it was 2018, the Pride flag was updated to the Progress flag. So it's a forward arrow representing progress, but it also includes representation for Black and Brown people, as well as specific representation for the trans and non-binary community as part of that progress arrow, in addition to the rainbow flag that we're all familiar with. So then there's the trans pride flag. The pink and blue represent the traditional or stereotypical colors of the binary genders, and the white in the middle represents non-binary. Sometimes you see this also with a black stripe in the middle, and that is the Black trans pride flag. So that's giving specific representation to Black trans folks, because they deserve it. I mean, that's sort of where Pride all started, was with the shot glass heard around the world from Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman in the Stonewall Inn. So then we have the Intersex Pride. The purple circle represents wholeness, that intersex folks are not broken. They are whole people. There's nothing wrong with them. Going down the line, everything means something, and I don't know everything about every flag, but there's meaning for every stripe, and I encourage people to look into it and get a better understanding of the different flag meanings. For me, I'm represented by, of course, the Progress flag, the Trans Pride flag, and the Pansexual Pride flag.
Thank you, Alana. And then we have, as you heard at the beginning when we were introducing ourselves, the topic of pronouns. It's something that has been asked as we were setting up this panel, but why is everybody using pronouns? Why are they being introduced in people's signatures, on their social media, and why does it matter? It matters in terms of, as we're going back to the understanding of what we assume of other people, as opposed to how they identify and how we communicate. As we have in this queer tidbit, knowing that only 38% of the world's population speak a gendered language, and yet it is a lot of our conversations around queer identity include being able to respect people along their preferred gendered pronouns. So she, her, they, them, he, him, she, her, these are some of the pronouns that people utilize. They matter because we cannot assume how someone identifies by their presentation. And so being able to A, share your own pronouns or ask somebody else their pronouns if they haven't shared them is a way of being able to understand without making those assumptions. Without going into too much more detail, just for the sake of time, we wanted to share this resource, which we'll include later as well, that has wonderful ways about not just only seeing the different pronoun uses, but also ways to practice it and understanding what happens if you make a mistake, how to talk about this with other people. So we'll share that a lot, but it's mypronouns.org. And I think it's a great resource for anybody who has questions or needs to get started. And now I have Marian join us.
So nobody owes you anything. Nobody owes you their queerness. The way I see this is that, oh yeah, let's talk about first coming out or being out, right? The LGBTQ plus queer community has made great strides in public opinion, but we still, have a lot of work ahead. The way I see this is that in life, you can move through, the gender and identity spectrums in many different ways. The process of coming out looks different for everyone, depending on different things, the context, where you grew up, the privileges that you had or the disadvantages, right? That each one of us has in life. So they are all valid, they are all important, and that's why it's very, it's fundamental to have these spaces to listen to ourselves. I think the lighting design industry, the architectural lighting design industry, derives many things from the work environments of the architecture world, but that is changing with new people and with cultural changes, right? The lighting industry, I think it's still dominated by white men, and those of us who want a different world, we have to sort of force the change, because white men have an easier way of navigating the lighting community and the world, and that is not okay, right? It's not okay for us. So it's important to create spaces like this one to diversify, and not only diversify, but advance the industry as much as we can. Not only diversify, but to humanize it also. I wish we could be more empathetic with the injustices of society and of the injustices of the world. Speaking about particularly Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, we have very interesting relationships with our bodies and with sexuality. I can say that we feel, in general, right? We feel very comfortable in our skins. Yet there's always a confrontation with the macho culture or with patriarchy. We have seen in the past years an increasing number of young people identifying themselves as part of the queer community and dominating the local artistic and design scene. But at the same time, on the other hand, we also have seen an increase in hate crimes. So that is very concerning. I'm a strong believer that cultural shifts need to happen from within the communities, right? And not forced upon us. So let's continue creating and promoting spaces like this where we can share what we think and feel. I have to say that even though no one owes you anything, we have to hold the industry accountable for not creating in the past spaces in which queer communities can feel safe and represented. But anyways, you know, looking forward, looking into the future, we're here, and let's keep this alive, this discussion alive.
Thank you, Marian. So we have also part of this panel is wanting to share our own experience. And I'll get started. As I said, my name is Francesca Bastianini. I am, my pronouns are she, her. So I'm a cisgendered white woman who was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and I was born and grew up there. And I moved to the States because I had the privilege of having an American mother that allowed me to sort of move easily to the US, where I was able to study, and decided to stay. I'm a lighting designer. I'm a self-proclaimed lighting dork. And all of that is part of my identity. I really, you know, I as many of you, any of you who know me, know that I take lighting seriously as something that encompasses a lot of parts of my life. So how does my being queer, my being a lesbian fit into that? It means that over time, I've had to figure out how comfortable I am being out, what conversations where I choose to share that information or not. I also have decided where do I want to live or not. I'm from Caracas, Venezuela. When I was growing up there, and I'm also, you know, would be in the category of an elder millennial. When I was growing up there wasn't anybody else. I didn't come out when I was still living in Venezuela because I didn't feel that it was possible for me to do so. Things have changed. The change is very slow, but I didn't see the opportunity after I had finished university to go back because I didn't see that part of my life, being able to be whole and present as a queer woman, was going to be possible. I didn't know where I was going to find friends. I didn't know where I was going to be able to look for partners. It doesn't mean that that can't change, but that is one of the reasons, sort of in terms of the trajectory of my life, one of the reasons that I decided to stay in the US. What else? It impacts how you know, I've become more comfortable in my skin. I've become more authentically myself over the years. And that's in part because our society and our organizations are becoming more open. But I do find that it's not always the most popular experience, and depending on where I am, I have the privilege of passing. I don't always present in a very queer looking way. I don't look incredibly masculine. All of those things allow me to live within society and not always be read as a lesbian. How does that impact my relationships? I have had the fortune of never having extremely negative interactions with others in the lighting industry because of my sexual orientation. However, I know that I don't necessarily have the ability to identify the same way as others do. It's, you know, there's a sense of difference. So I'm fortunate. I recognize that I have a lot of privilege in that sense, and to be able to take the opportunity that I can be comfortable in my skin, so that there are others who can look to me as a role model, not because I'm tooting my own horn, but just because if they can see me as a designer, as the owner of a firm, as a participant in professional organizations, as an instructor, and see that I am living my life happily, healthily, and authentically, that is somebody for them to reach out to share with, and to look forward to. I want that for other people because I wanted that for myself. So that's a little bit about my experience. I've had the benefit of having started a firm, which also meant that I was able to, with an incredible business partner and friend, be able to live authentically and share that with others and not have that be something that had stopped me from being queer and being out in my work. I want to stop there because I think that there's a lot more that we want to hear from the rest of the panelists. So with that, I'm going to move a spotlight and have Sophie go ahead.
So, hello again, Sophie here. My pronouns are she, her. I'd like to take a second to talk about intersectional feminism, because I think we're all coming from this sort of women in lighting background, and we've been talking a lot about feminism over the past couple of years. And Marianne, when you said, we have to be empathetic to the injustices of the world, I think really intersectional feminism for me in particular it's a tool of empathy. It's something that can really help teach you about other people, and that's quite key to navigating the world, especially as a designer. So we'll start with the definition. Intersectional feminism is an analytical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. The term was conceptualized and coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So essentially, it's a way of viewing the world through different layers of privilege. As you can see here in this diagram, there are many different things that can affect a person's personal experience, including your sexuality, including age, whether you're able-bodied or not, your education, your race, all of these things build a person's identity. And really, viewing the world through this lens has really helped me personally and professionally. Personally, I can approach people with this new lens of better understanding what their experience is and how that might have affected them. And then obviously professionally, that then as a designer leads you into this sort of world of being able to actually help people properly. If you, for example, if you built a building with no, wheelchair access, no ramps and no lifts, then you're excluding people who are differently abled. It doesn't stop there though, it's many other different things. There's a TED talk I've linked in the resources that we'll get to in a bit by Kimberly Crenshaw. And she said, if you can't see a problem, you can't solve it. So how are we as designers meant to help people when we can't see the problems? It's not always as obvious though as, wheelchair access. So an example that's a little bit more nuanced than that is, say, climate change and fast fashion. So fast fashion obviously is an incredible polluter, and the alternative to that is slow fashion. Slow fashion is, however, incredibly expensive. I personally can't afford it. And so what I do is I shop at charity shops, thrift stores, op shops, that sort of thing. But the problem is the context of my life allows me to do that. I am white, cisgendered, young, middle class. All of these things mean that I can wear secondhand clothes and it's kind of fashionable. I'm also a designer. And to be a designer, I had to go and get a degree from university. Luckily in Australia, that's not as hard as it is in the US, but I still had to have a lot of privilege to be able to do all of that. So, and another example that we're living through at the moment is COVID. A lot of people, I think, have taken maybe for granted the privilege afforded to them of being able to physically isolate. Not everyone around the world can self-isolate. Not everyone has the money to pay for grocery delivery when you might be isolating or sick. And the infrastructure of technology and good internet. I'm in my bedroom right now. That's a huge privilege to be able to do this with a room alone, to sort of have the space and the good internet to be able to talk to you guys. So I think once you start to view the world in that way, and to be able to put yourselves in people's shoes in a bit more of a realistic way, then you'll be able to see the problems and you'll be a better designer. And another point is I'd like to sort of tack onto that is with modern feminism and with intersectional feminism, the conversation is more becoming, less becoming women need to be like men and be equal to men. It's more like everyone suffers under the patriarchal society we live in. Suicide rates of men are high. Toxic masculinity affects men. Not even men are safe from it, right? And so what we really want to aim for is we want a new society. We want everyone to come along. We want everyone to be equal, including people affected by any of these privileges or discriminators you see in front of you. So basically, queer rights should matter to you no matter who you are. Racial issues should, classism should, ableism should, no matter who you are. We're all suffering under this society, and the only way that we're all going to sort of be liberated from it is if we start liberating the least privileged. And I'd like to end that with basically, I know when you sort of start down this path, it can be a little bit overwhelming because like there's so much research to be done and there's so many books to read and podcasts to listen to. But I think if you're wanting to start learning and you don't really know where to start, I've linked again in the resources down below 5 Instagram accounts, because I think while social media can be a bit of a drain on, you know, our mental health, at the same time it can be a tool for good. And Instagram accounts and even TikTok accounts, I know it sounds silly, but there's a lot of candid discussion back and forth. There's a lot of good dialogue that's good to just listen to and read. And often those Instagram accounts have really good book and podcast recommendations about specific topics if you're interested. So yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And next we have Alana.
I'm Alana Shepard, she, her, as I said before. And so my relationship to queerness is, well, it's, I didn't always know. I mean, in one sense I always knew, but in another sense I didn't. When I was a kid, I felt something that I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I would experiment as a preteen and as a teen with clothing and with makeup and different ways of feminine expression, and I felt different. But the society at the time, and really still in a lot of ways, made that feel wrong. It made it feel deviant. I mean, just look at transgender portrayals from anything prior to like 5 years ago, and it was pretty horrible. I mean, any transgender person you saw in film or television or in books was a murderer or some kind of deviant or a joke, just a joke. And having that media soak into you day after day in your formative years, when you know you're that person, has a really detrimental impact. So much so that after a point, it got suppressed below my level of consciousness. And I lived life for 40 years before it resurfaced again. And, you know, to plug the importance of taking care of your mental health, it wasn't until I started therapy. So I encourage anybody and everybody to take care of your mental health and see a therapist once in a while at the least, just to keep things in check. I started going to therapy to take care of some relationship issues, and there was something else. There was just something just like, couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something affecting my success and my happiness. And it was outside of therapy, just in living life, that it came to the surface. I was, you know, able to better understand myself, and it bubbled up. And it was just this little thing where I admitted to myself that, you know, I'm not entirely binary. And I started pulling that thread. And that thread just kept coming and kept coming. And there was a point at which I had to acknowledge it, and I had to start living my life that way. So in the fall of 2019, I came out as gender fluid. Turns out that was a stepping stone, but I did. And at the time I was working in sales. I tailored my expression depending on who I was with, because as we've touched on, different areas of this industry in different parts of the country respond differently. And I was very nervous. I would approach things much differently today. Anyway, I digress slightly. But as time went on after that, after the fall of 2019, it became more clear to me that that wasn't the whole story. I am a transgender woman. So that became, well, I told my family in March and I told the world in May. And that was during the pandemic, and I've been able to use the pandemic as a chrysalis to become my true self. And now that the world is opening up, I'm ready, and the timing it's serendipitous, really. I was able to go through some of the more awkward stages in isolation, which was rather convenient. So the way my coming out, my expression has affected work, like I said, I was terrified of going into certain places. So I covered everything from New York City to, Rochester, New York, or, even smaller markets. And the prospect of going into an engineer's office in the hinterlands was just terrifying. And, I'd seen it from the cisgender, the cis passing perspective. The comments that people make and just the attitudes that people hold. So the effect that would have on my performance as a salesperson was frightening. I saw myself as a liability. And I was afraid of losing my job. There were no employee protections at the time. That's since changed with the June 2020 ruling by the Supreme Court that extended Title VII protections to LGBTQ individuals. But I was afraid of my job, afraid for my job. Now I was told that wasn't a concern. Things changed with my work situation. It's all pretty much unrelated to my queerness, and I ended up not having a job by the time I came out as trans, but that's somewhat beside the point. But then I found myself transgender looking for work during a pandemic, and it was really hard to tell what affected what. So I would apply and interview with a company over email and application forms, and over the phone, or I talked to recruiters over the phone, and I would be very careful with my voice. I would make sure my voice was pretty much passing, and I try not to make it an issue. I was advised to do that. And it was just impossible to tell whether, because it would have to come out at some point, and it was impossible to tell whether or not my transness affected the success of my application. The pandemic really played into that. So that's always going to sit in the back of my mind, whether that was a factor. And it's important that we just need to be more out there and more present and more, make the world more accepting, so that's less of an issue. And I started NACLIQ for that reason, to create a space, to create space for us. It was last year during education. I was attending a panel hosted by Wild, veteran women in the lighting industry, and they were trading war stories about the discrimination and the harassment they faced, back in the 80s and such. as women in a men's world. And I wanted to reframe that to the modern trans experience and see what advice they could offer, what perspectives they might have, and how that might relate. And I didn't feel like I had the space to do it. And that inspired me to start NACLIQ. And since then, we've made it our mission to make that space, to make it safe everywhere, particularly in those hinterlands, in the rep's office, in the distributors' offices, in the contracting companies, to exist, to be ourselves. And we're just getting going, and we're just getting the visibility. This is a great platform. I'm really grateful for Women in Lighting and WILD to give us this opportunity. And I want to make this grow, and I want to keep working to give us the space to exist. That's really what this is all about, to make people feel comfortable to exist as themselves. Pretty much all I have to say about myself.
Thank you so much. And then we will have Marian join us.
Hello.
All right.
Thank you. So again, my name is Marian. My pronouns she, her. I grew up in Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there. I was raised by a single mother who was pretty active in political work with communities. Among these communities was the LGBTQ plus community. I'm very fortunate to say that my uncles and aunts were the ones that first started organizing the Pride parade in the island. So I was really privileged in that sense that I always felt completely free to be whoever I wanted to be and to do with my life whatever I wanted to do with my life. I also grew up with a sense of responsibility, of changing for the better, not only my life, but to help others, change for the better their circumstances, for those particularly that didn't have the same opportunities that I had. My background in lighting is in stage lighting design. I started in the off scene in Puerto Rico, doing theater, contemporary dance, alternative music. So for me, it was also okay to be open in those spaces. It was okay to be queer. It was okay to be out, because I usually am, either hanging out or working with artists, designers, with writers, etc. So I can say that it's pretty clear in Puerto Rico that I am queer. And I'm very obviously proud of that. And that has played to my advantage because people see me like, I'm very comfortable and I'm sure of what I'm doing and saying, right? I saw one of the, perhaps, trying to answer one of the questions. I think it's a good question to open. Someone was asking if you find that you have a sort of split personality in front of your colleagues and clients, or are you always you? I think that's a great question. For me, the opposite happened when I started with the architectural lighting design community. I felt very I feel still very comfortable in Puerto Rico, in my country. But I felt that there was like a problem if I was myself and I was open For example, when I had to go to interviews for jobs, or if I took the job and started to, you know, create relationships with my coworkers, there was something always uncomfortable for me, at least. But it's always it's also a different culture. I don't know if it's because of that, because it's the U.S. You know, there are many different layers into that situation. I think you know, this community, the lighting design community, responds and reacts too much to the forces of the market. You know, but like I said, I also know that we have a responsibility to open these spaces and start with yourself, right? With knowing that you have a space, and if you feel like you don't, you have the responsibility to create the space for yourself. I am very, you know, happy that this type of spaces exist, where we can, you know, just have a very cool and open conversation, feel represented. I have experienced discrimination for being queer, or for being a woman, and for being a young woman, and also for being a Latina, right? It's very, there are many you know, nuances into that sort of problems and situations. But one of the things that I want to do under the Women in Lighting Puerto Rico and Caribbean umbrella is, and I think it's a magnificent opportunity, is I want to change, or help to change, the tone in the work environments in our countries. I think there's still a lot of great conversations we're just starting to have. And at least in Puerto Rico, we're a bit behind in those things, in those areas, comparing to other countries in the world where it's more normal to see women working in lighting design, or queer women working in lighting design. So yeah, that's what I have to share up to now, but I'm always here in case someone wants to continue the conversation after this panel.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. It seems like a great segue, as we have a question specifically about that in our Q&A panel. And then we're now opening this up. I know that it may be lunch for some of you, it might be early morning. So if not everybody can stay, we will share information afterwards. But if you can, please submit some questions in the Q&A function, and we're happy to answer questions. Just keep it respectful. So we have the first question, which Alana, if you will share with us. So we have a question which you can read out, because I'm trying to find the window.
Yeah, so the question was asked, would NACLIQ consider consulting with companies in the industry to improve their diversity statements and practices, either through Zoom presentations or directly? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. I think that's very important. I think some companies try with earnest, good intentions, and they do it without guidance, and they get things a little bit off. I think, you know, one of those companies that I mentioned had a very binary diversity policy, and it was leaving a whole spectrum of genders out of the equation. You know, a whole spectrum of genders that were not represented by their diversity policy. It probably wasn't deliberate, but it needed to be corrected. And I would absolutely welcome advising these companies on going forward with their diversity and equity policies. Certainly.
Thank you, Alana. So I'm going to take a question from one of the submitted questions, and that is somewhat of a light question of who are your LGBTQ idols or famous folks? So that's open to anyone. I'll start by saying that I had a hard time when I saw this question come in because I don't necessarily know, particularly within the realm of design, who are my sort of like queer design heroes. There is an organization called Queries that started to ask this as a prompt on their social media, and that's one of the resources that we will share. But I think it comes down to like individuals, professors who I knew were queer, and just knowing that even if we didn't have a discussion meant that there was somebody that I could look up to. So that's my workaround to that question.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know anyone other than you guys. So I have to say that you know, you guys are my role models right now. But yeah, we have to definitely keep producing more role models, right? In the future.
Agreed. Fashion design and music and all of that. Yeah, there's millions of options, but yeah, I don't know, that question stumped me.
I see that Sophie has clarified that part of the question was like not just in design, but in general. I mean, I probably have a crush on a lot of what you would call lesbian folk rock artists like Melissa Ferrick, but I don't know. I think that's an area where we could use some more idols to look up to.
I agree completely. I have my own stable of queer folk rock icons. I've crushed on Ani DeFranco for decades. More specific to design, that is tough. I mean, look at me. As far as I know, I'm the only trans person in lighting design. If somebody can prove me wrong, please do. I'm tired of being alone. But as far as idols go, I look to probably the most direct inspiration on like a daily basis is Sarah Mcbride. She is a state legislator in Delaware. She is the first openly trans state senator in the United States. And I followed her since she began her primary campaign before she was elected. And, you know, it's really tiny. And I was just on a daily basis, I was just inspired by her initiative and her courage and just the ability to put herself out there. And honestly, I think she's the reason that Joe Biden is so vocal in his support for trans people. In fact, one of the posters that the Biden campaign put out right after the election, showing all the supporters of Biden, it's a drawing, but one of those pictures, one of those drawings is of Sarah Mcbride, right to Biden's right. And it just seeing her work every day just gives me the strength to keep going. In broader popular culture, I'd say maybe the Wachowski sisters. Yeah, you know, two siblings at the, you know, already having achieved tremendous success, coming out and continuing to work and be successful. You know, they created Sense8, which is a great series if you haven't seen it, on Netflix. And they're continuing to do great work. There's a new Matrix movie coming out, I think, next year.
Sophie, I was going to ask if you, moving on to a question from Paulo, do you feel like there's a European sort of LGBTQ lighting network or anything that you feel within the UK or you've heard of elsewhere, so that we're not so US centric?
Yeah, a colleague asked me that today, and my answer was, I don't know. I don't know of anything. And I think it's quite indicative of that I'm the only person not from America on this panel, right? Or not living in America, right? Because I can't think of any, and I might be totally wrong, and I'd be happy to be proven wrong. I've really been living in Europe for 4 years, but I don't really know of any in Australia either, to be honest. So yeah, if there's any, come at me. Where are you?
Thank you. And I think it's also one thing to note is that this is the network and sort of the speaking out about this as is also more recent. So that may be some, we don't necessarily know, as we've been essentially more open in more recent years. So prove us wrong. Help us if we don't know something, because we don't have all the answers. So thank you. And I had a question from Sophie. Given the US now has gender equality, anti-discrimination legislation, do you think it will take many years to win the hearts and minds of people towards the LGBTQ community? Alana?
Sure. I don't actually. I think the tide's already turning in a lot of ways. It's what we're experiencing in terms of legislation is a very vocal, directed campaign led by a very small number of people. But if you look at some of the statistics in the broader community, the numbers supporting queer and specifically trans folks is growing year by year, and I think it's up into the 60% or more of the general population in the United States. That's, I mean, we're supposed to take that as good news. It's when you start to think about it, it's maybe less good news, but it's better than it's been. And I think that's important, and also the momentum that is forming is important, and I see it every day. I live 40 minutes north of Spokane, Washington. Spokane is the second largest city in the state of Washington, and I live in a tiny community of like 2,000 or 3,000 people. That is an odd mix of commuters to Spokane and farmers and meth heads. So, so it's a fascinating mix to live as a trans woman. But given that, the acceptance is tremendous. I've had almost no trouble here, and my neighbors who are all, I mean, let's be honest, there is kind of a political divide where acceptance is concerned. They're almost all Trump supporters, and they all accept me. So I think that says a lot.
Yeah. I do think that there has been a fairly rapid, sort of statistically rapid level of acceptance for the queer population in a fairly short amount of time historically. But I want to make sure that we go on. This is a question which I think is real helpful, and maybe Sophie, you can start as an ally. What's sort of, how can I really make a difference is the question. I think we had spoken prior to this about allyship as one of the important steps forward.
Yeah, I think much like what we've been learning through all the sort of conversations about Black Lives Matter, we can apply those sorts of things to queerness as well, and to feminism. Like, rather than just not being homophobic, be actively homophobic. Go, if someone says a slur in front of you, and maybe you're not gay and no one else in the room is gay, be brave enough to stand up and say, actually, I don't find that funny. And why are you saying that? What's the joke? I don't get it, you know? And also just listen and promote those voices when people speak out, because I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to speak out about it. So yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. Marian, is there anything you want to add?
No, I just I just wanted to, I'm with Sophie in that, it's very, very important to be brave enough and raise your voice and be the one that sometimes causes a discomfort. That's okay, and that's not only okay, that's cool, and that's necessary, and we have to do it, own it, and don't be afraid of changing things and changing people's heads and values and your work environment dynamics. It's very important for you to own it, to own the space.
Thank you. I know that we're coming to the close. I just wanted to ask a panel. I know that we've answered several of the questions that have come in. If we haven't gotten to your questions, we will be able to share additional resources. And I know that we're available after this presentation to be able to follow up if there's anything that you didn't feel comfortable asking or comes up once you've started to mull over and process this. With that, I would like to just share my screen once more. What I'd like to share is we have some resources that we will share with you all as well, but that includes the organizations that are joint came together to put this program on: Women in Lighting, NACLIQ, Women in Lighting and Design, all which have newsletters, LinkedIn, social media representation, so you can also follow and contact us there, as well as the websites, the resource on pronouns, Queries, which is a wonderful organization looking at queer identities and design, as well as some history, and even a lovely podcast on the etymology of the word queer, which Sophie also touched on. In addition, we have some Instagram accounts, some that you can follow, and some additional information about sort of intersectional feminism. And finally, we have upcoming events. So following all of these organizations, you'll see that we have a variety of things going on. Specifically, NACLIQ, there's a Pride happy hour, as we are in Pride still this month. That is tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern EDT and 2 p.m. PDT. Also, if you're not in the US, come and join. Come see your faces. And Queer Perspectives in Architectural Lighting is actually a panel that Alana will be participating, has organized as a partner for the ArcLight Summit, which is occurring in September in person. So that's another upcoming event, although at the end of the summer. And finally, thank you again for joining us. This is a great opportunity to be able to share openly. And I wanted to thank Kelly Roberts again from Wild for being able to help us with registration and hosting this on the webinar, as well as the Delansky Group for sponsoring the webinar. And then thank our panelists, Sophie, Marian, Alana. Thank you very much for your time, and for our attendees for taking time out of your day to join us.